6 a.m. The Spratly Islands. The sun had just risen, a bright red streak stretching across the horizon. The sunlight shone on the mirror-calm sea surface, but this silence was only deceptive. An enormous Chinese Coast Guard ship, white hull with proud red stripes, was gliding. It was like a mobile wall of steel. Opposite it were two Vietnamese Coast Guard ships, smaller, lower, but moving flexibly, determined not to give way. All three ships were circling each other in a tense dance, keeping a distance of only a few hundred meters. Suddenly, the Chinese ship roared. Its engine growled, black smoke sputtering out. It aimed its high-pressure water cannon straight at the Vietnamese ship. A white stream of water, strong as liquid concrete, slammed directly into the command cabin. Glass shattered everywhere. Electronics sparked, short-circuiting. The Vietnamese captain was thrown backward by the force, his head smashing hard against the steel bulkhead. Blood immediately streamed down his face. The Vietnamese ship listed violently, almost losing control. At that moment, not far away, a Vietnamese wooden fishing boat was frantically pulling in its nets. The fishermen were yelling, trying to start the engine to escape the danger zone. The giant Chinese Coast Guard ship immediately spotted the new target. The giant Chinese Coast Guard ship immediately spotted the new target. The giant white hull rushed toward the fishing boat, like a great white shark hunting. At that moment, not far away, there was no chance of escape. The fishermen could only stand, silently, eyes wide, watching the steel wall rushing toward them. A hideous screech of crushed wood rang out. An enormous Chinese Coast Guard ship, white hull with proud red stripes, was gliding. Splinters flew everywhere. The wooden ship shattered instantly, torn in two. The terrible force of the impact threw all the fishermen into the sea, sinking them into the vortex. The fishing boat sank in less than 30 seconds. Only debris and an oil slick remained on the sea surface. The Chinese ship stopped, drifting silently. It had just committed an act of murder. On the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship, the captain wiped the streak of blood on his face. He and the entire crew had witnessed it all. Fury replaced restraint. He grabbed the microphone, yelling. The combat alarm horn tore through the morning air. It was no longer a collision. The fuse on the sea had been lit. 6:15 a.m. The combat alarm horn from the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship was still wailing. Just then, from the horizon, a grey ash-colored ship silhouette rushed forward. It was not a Coast Guard ship. The hull was low, angular, and armed with weapons. A frigate of the Vietnamese Navy. It was already on patrol nearby and was immediately dispatched upon detecting the collision. Fury replaced restraint. It was not a Coast Guard ship. A clear shielding action. It cut through the waves, rushing straight between the giant Chinese Coast Guard ship and the wounded Vietnamese Coast Guard ship. Immediately, from the deck of the Vietnamese frigate, a flare was fired. It exploded in the sky, a bright red star warning the Chinese ship not to advance. It was the signal to comply with maritime rules. Stop. In response, the Chinese Coast Guard ship showed absolute contempt. On its white flanks, steel plates concealing weapons suddenly slid aside, revealing not water cannons, but the dark muzzles of heavy machine guns. They simultaneously spat fire, not aimed at the frigate. They aimed straight at the wounded Vietnamese Coast Guard ship, the one with the broken cabin. A warship had just placed itself in position to protect. They slammed into the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship's cabin like a rain of steel. Metal was torn apart. The remaining glass fragments shattered. Bullets tore through the control panel, turning electronics into showers of sparks. Bullets pierced the bulkheads, creating hundreds of holes. The Vietnamese sailors inside yelled, scrambling to get flat on the floor. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. The first shot of the war had been fired. It was not an accident. The Vietnamese sailors inside yelled, scrambling to get flat on the floor. 7 a.m. Spratlys. A few nautical miles from the center of the naval engagement, a coral reef emerged from the water. It was small, just a strip of white sand and jagged coral, but on it was planted a Vietnamese flag. This was one of the sovereignty outposts. From the Chinese warship, 2 black high-speed boats were deployed. They were filled with soldiers in black, armed to the teeth. Chinese special forces. They cut through the waves, rushing straight for the reef. Their objective: remove the flag. On the reef, the guarding Vietnamese marine team saw an alarm siren blood. An alarm siren blood. They're coming to combat positions. The Vietnamese soldiers jumped into position, chambering machine guns, barrels pointed at the sea. They had no concrete fortifications, only sandbags and courage. They're coming to combat positions. As soon as the bows hit the sand, the special forces jumped out, water splashing. They knew they could not lose this reef. A machine gun roared, spraying a long line of fire. They knew they could not lose this reef. They're coming to combat positions. The Vietnamese soldiers jumped into position, chambering machine guns, barrels pointed at the sea. A machine gun roared, spraying a long line of fire. But the Chinese special forces were too many. The Vietnamese soldiers jumped into position, chambering machine guns, barrels pointed at the sea. The engagement immediately turned into an extremely close-quarters battle. A Vietnamese soldier threw a grenade. The grenade exploded, throwing 2 Chinese soldiers. But another soldier had gotten close. He used his rifle butt to smash the Vietnamese soldier in the face. The sound of breaking bone rang out. Both fell, grappling on the sand. No longer gunfire. This was hand-to-hand combat. A Vietnamese soldier ran out of ammo. He drew a dagger, roared, and charged straight at a Chinese soldier. The Chinese soldier raised his rifle to block. As soon as the bows hit the sand, the special forces jumped out, water splashing. A Vietnamese soldier ran out of ammo. Both collapsed together. The clear seawater around the reef began to change color. Blood spreading, blood from both sides, staining the entire coral sand area bright red. The life and death battle for every inch of the submerged reef had just begun. 7:30 a.m. Mainland, Ministry of Defense Combat Command Center. The air was silent, but it was a silence stretched taut like a string. On the giant video wall, red dots representing Chinese forces in the Spratlys. Mainland, Ministry of Defense Combat Command Center. The officers on duty stared intently at the screen. The video signal from the engagement area was heavily jammed. Only snow, static, and ear-splitting screeches remained. Suddenly, an encrypted audio channel connected. A voice came through, broken, mixed with machine gun fire and the roar of engines. Fishing boat rammed and sunk. Fishermen missing. Chinese ship opened fire. Repeat. They opened fire with heavy weapons on the Coast Guard ship. The entire room held its breath. The voice continued, more desperate. Chinese special forces are attacking the reef. We are in close combat. Requesting support. Requesting. The signal cut out. Only static remained. A general slammed his hand on the table. The dry sound echoed. Confirmed, he roared. Signal is lost. General, the technical officer replied. The signal cut out. Only static remained. But we have the record. Confirmed armed engagement. Confirmed casualties. The truth was clear. This was no longer a collision. This was a military invasion. The decision was made immediately. No further discussion needed. The general picked up the red secure phone. This was a military invasion. Signal is lost. General, the technical officer replied. The order was transmitted via encrypted lines, fast as an electric shock. It spread to the military region 1 and 2 commands. It went straight to the border outposts, the artillery bases, the secret tank bunkers deep in the mountains. Immediately, from Lang Son to Hajiang, from Quang Ninh to Lai Chau, on thousands of kilometers of treacherous border, a single sound tore through the morning silence. An alarm siren screamed. It echoed through the valleys, rebounding off the cliffs. A sound signaling war. All guns turned toward the north. 8 RM, the northern borderline. The highest level alarm siren was still echoing, rebounding off the limestone cliffs. At a Vietnamese border outpost, the air was tense enough to break. The border soldiers, their faces still sleepy, were now hardened. They were rushing out of the bunkers, checking ammo, putting on helmets, running to combat positions. They had received the news from the sea, but they didn't know what was about to happen. The silence lasted exactly 5 minutes after the alarm order. 5 minutes of deadly silence. Then, from the other side of the border, not one word of warning. Not one declaration of war. The ground trembled. Dozens, hundreds of mobile rocket artillery launchers simultaneously raised their barrels to the sky. Not one declaration of war. Not one word of warning. The entire northern sky lit up. A simultaneous roar, not gunfire, but the scream of 1,000 fire dragons. Hundreds of rockets, then thousands, spat fire from their launchers. They drew white smoke trails, tearing apart the morning sky. They flew up in a perfect arc, then pointed straight down. Target. All Vietnamese border outposts, radar stations, logistics depots, within a 15-kilometer range. At the border outpost, the sentry in the watchtower only had time to see the sky blotted out by black dots. He didn't have time to scream. The first volley dove down. They screamed. An ear-splitting sound. The ground exploded. Dirt, concrete, and human bodies were thrown into the sky. The border outpost disappeared in a cloud of fire and smoke. Hellfire from the north had rained down. The steel rain had begun. Kahadeksan. 8:15 a.m. The border. The steel rain was still pouring down. Kahadeksan. 8:15 a.m. The border. The border outpost, once a solid concrete fortress, was now shattering. A rocket pierced straight through the thick concrete roof of the command bunker. It exploded inside. The entire command staff and technical team inside were thrown. They were crushed by the terrible pressure. The bunker collapsed instantly, burying them all alive under tons of earth and rock. The outpost's electronic signal went silent. Outside, hell was even worse. The bunker collapsed instantly, burying them all alive under tons of earth and rock. When suddenly it was hit directly by a rocket artillery shell. The entire gun nest, including the 2 soldiers, vanished in a fireball. Nothing was left. Border soldiers trying to run to individual shelters were chased by the fire. The ground around them exploded. They were thrown. Shrapnel tore through their bodies. Blood splattered, mixing with the mud, black with gunpowder. They died without understanding what had just happened. The national flagpole stood tall in the middle of the yard. An artillery shell exploded right next to it. The pressure bent the steel flagpole. It snapped. The national flagpole stood tall in the middle of the yard. The entire gun nest, including the 2 soldiers, vanished in a fireball. The entire frontline defense system was paralyzed. The fortified border outpost was now just a smoking ruin, a giant crater. And then, the artillery rain went silent. A terrifying silence fell. The entire frontline defense system was paralyzed. The fortified border outpost was now just a smoking ruin, a giant crater. The border was now just a smoking wasteland. The sky was thick with the smell of gunpowder, burning concrete, and the acrid smell of burnt flesh. The silence after the bombardment was even more terrifying than the explosions. Then it came. The ground began to tremble. Not the sudden tremor of bombardment. This was a steady, heavy vibration, approaching, a roar of diesel engines and the sound of steel treads crushing rock. From the other side of the border, through the thick black smoke, giant shadows began to emerge. The first one, a modern Chinese tank. Its angular armor was caked with mud. The long, dark cannon barrel pointed straight ahead, scanning the ruins. It didn't stop at the borderline. It plowed straight through. Next came the second, It didn't stop at the borderline. The 50th. They were no longer individual tanks. They were a flood of steel. Hundreds of modern tanks and armored personnel carriers formed a giant armored spearhead, swarming across the border. Their steel treads crushed everything left of the border outpost. They crushed the blown-away barbed wire fences, crushing the shattered concrete bunkers. They paid no attention to the scattered bodies of the Vietnamese border soldiers. The hatches of the armored personnel carriers burst open while moving. Fully armed Chinese infantry soldiers jumped down, fanning out to the sides, supporting the tank column. The hatches of the armored personnel carriers burst open while moving. Fully armed Chinese infantry soldiers jumped down. The hatches of the armored personnel carriers burst open while moving. Fully armed Chinese infantry soldiers jumped down. The mechanized infantry invasion had officially begun. In a narrow valley covered by jungle, the ground suddenly trembled. A giant rock, perfectly camouflaged, slowly slid to one side. It revealed a pitch-black bunker opening, breathing out cold air. Inside the darkness, two steel eyes began to glow, headlights on. Then a terrifying whine of a gas turbine erupted, drowning out the distant echo of artillery. The roar was not from a typical diesel engine. It was sharp, piercing, and full of power. A plume of thick black smoke shot out from the bunker opening. A modern Vietnamese tank began to crawl out. The first one. Its jungle camouflage paint was still new. Steel treads screeched on the concrete, climbing the ramp and emerging into the sunlight. Its long cannon barrel, automatically raised, scanning sideways. These were not garrison tanks. They were the main force, hidden, waiting for this exact moment. From other hidden bunkers, dozens of Vietnamese steel beasts awoke simultaneously. Engines roared, shattering the silence of the jungle. At another base, tank crews, faces hardened, were rushing out of the barracks. They didn't say a word. They climbed onto their tanks, hatches slamming shut. The older diesel engines, perfectly maintained, roared to life. Smoke billowed thickly. The tank commanders, leather helmets on, yelled into the radio, "All units, bearing 350. They are entering the valley." Roger. A Vietnamese tank company, cannons facing forward, began to charge out of the base. They tore through the base's own barbed wire fences, no time to open the gate. They charged straight through the fields, crushing trees, forming a steel spearhead. They knew where they were going. They knew what they were about to face. They charged straight through the fields, crushing trees, forming a steel spearhead. They were not retreating. They were charging straight to a deadly rendezvous to stop the enemy's swarm of steel dragons. 9:30 a.m. The Valley of Death. Gutu Valley. This is a narrow valley, flanked by sheer limestone cliffs. The Valley of Death. Gutu Valley. They charged straight through the fields, crushing trees, forming a steel spearhead. The Valley of Death. Gutu Valley. They were not retreating. They were charging straight to a deadly rendezvous to stop the enemy's swarm of steel dragons. The Valley of Death. Gutu Valley. This is a narrow valley, flanked by sheer limestone cliffs. They charged straight through the fields, crushing trees, forming a steel spearhead. They charged straight through the fields, crushing trees, forming a steel spearhead. The Valley of Death. Gutu Valley. This is a narrow valley, flanked by sheer limestone cliffs. They charged straight through the fields, crushing trees, forming a steel spearhead. They had just crossed 15 kilometers without significant resistance, aside from minefields already cleared by artillery. They thought the first defensive line had been completely broken. They drove straight into the trap. Wait. The Vietnamese commander's voice came over the radio, cold and decisive. Let them get in deep. And this is the place the Vietnamese armored forces chose to make their stand. Wait. The Vietnamese commander's voice came over the radio, cold and decisive. Let them get in deep. Wait. The Vietnamese commander's voice came over the radio, cold and decisive. Let them get in deep. Its turbine shrieked. The tank dipped slightly. Its cannon barrel spat out a giant fireball. The first cannon blast tore through the valley, echoing off the cliffs. The armor-piercing round shot forward like a streak of light. It flew faster than sound. It slammed into the front armor of the lead Chinese tank. The thick armor was pierced. Molten steel splattered. The round exploded inside the driver's compartment, detonating the entire ammo rack. 1 second of silence. Then the Chinese tank exploded from the inside. An explosion tore it apart. The turret, weighing dozens of tons, was thrown into the sky, spinning before crashing down to earth, crushing an armored vehicle following behind. A column of black smoke and fire rose to the sky. The death match had begun. Immediately, the valley turned into hell. Return fire, return fire. A scream came over the Chinese radio. The Chinese tank column hastily fanned out, cannons spinning wildly, searching for targets. But the Vietnamese tanks had opened fire simultaneously, from behind the rocks, from inside the bushes, from on top of the low hills. Streaks of fire crisscrossed the valley. Tank cannons cracked continuously. A deafening sound. The screeching of steel treads as the steel monsters maneuvered, finding firing positions. A Chinese tank was hit. Its track broken. It dragged, spinning in place. It became a silent fortress. A Chinese tank was hit. Its track broken. But the Vietnamese tanks had opened fire simultaneously, trying to flank. It fired a shot and missed. Immediately, 2 Chinese tanks turned their cannons toward it. 2 shots fired almost simultaneously. Both shells slammed into the Vietnamese tank's hull. It shattered. It turned into a giant torch. This was not a tactical battle. This was a brutal steel brawl. At close quarters, machines weighing dozens of tons were trying to kill each other. The ground trembled. Thick black smoke blotted out the Sunday. 10 a.m. The Valley of Death, Gutu Valley. The direct firefight was at its brutal peak. The air was thick, suffocating. The smoke was so thick the crews could barely see their targets. They had to fire at the flashes appearing through the gunpowder fog. The narrow valley now echoed with the roar of engines, cannon blasts, and the sound of tearing metal, creating a symphony of destruction. A modern Vietnamese tank, having just moved to avoid a shot, exposed its flank for a moment. A Chinese tank gunner, eyes glued to his thermal screen, had been waiting for this moment. He roared, "Target! Locked!" The computer system locked the target instantly. He pressed the fire button. The Chinese cannon spat fire. The sabot armor-piercing round, an arrow of super-dense metal, shot forward at unbelievable speed. It slammed into the side armor of the Vietnamese tank. The thick armor, designed to resist frontal shots, was defeated. The round pierced the steel, heating up to thousands of degrees C. It flew through the fighting compartment. It tore apart the loader, turning him into a pulpy mess. It broke the cannon breech from the inside. It plunged straight into the engine at the rear. But the worst was yet to come. The heat and shrapnel from the impact had detonated the reserve ammunition. The Vietnamese tank stopped dead. For 1 second, it was silent. Then, a horrific explosion from within. Terrible pressure sought escape. It blew the multi-ton turret into the air. The turret spun like a top before crashing down, crushing its own hull. The round pierced the steel, heating up to thousands of degrees C. It looked like a volcano crater. The entire crew inside was instantly incinerated. They didn't have a second to scream. It looked like a volcano crater. The turret spun like a top before crashing down, crushing its own hull. Blood, grease, and liquid metal oozed from the cracks in the hull. It looked like a volcano crater. Its horrific death was witnessed by the other tanks. The turret spun like a top before crashing down, crushing its own hull. They just tightened their grip on the trigger, kept firing, determined to avenge their fallen comrades. It looked like a volcano crater. Spratly's. While the tank deathmatch was happening at the border, the naval front had also escalated beyond all limits. Spratly's. While the tank deathmatch was happening at the border, the naval front had also escalated beyond all limits. Now, the warships of both sides had pulled back, forming two opposing steel lines. It looked like a volcano crater. It wasn't the sound of naval cannons. It was the scream of jet engines. From the horizon, they appeared, 4 black dots flying very low, skimming the waves. Chinese fighter jets. They had taken off from a nearby artificial island base. They rushed forward at terrifying speed. On the Vietnamese frigate, the air defense radar screamed, "Alert! Enemy aircraft, bearing 270. Extremely low." The captain yelled, "Activate air defense. Weapons free. Fire." The ship's automatic anti-aircraft cannons began to spin, barrels raising to the sky, frantically searching for targets. The cannons began to roar, firing a thick wall of flak into the sky, trying to create a steel net to stop the iron birds. "Alert! Enemy aircraft, bearing 270. Extremely low." The captain yelled, "Activate air defense. Weapons free. Fire." The first one zoomed past, firing a volley of rockets. Rockets slammed into the sea, exploding, creating giant water columns that threw the Vietnamese ship. The second one flew lower. It banked its wings. Under its wing, a dark grey object detached. A guided bomb. It fell silently. The bomb plunged straight into the middle of the Vietnamese frigate, right behind the command bridge. It pierced the thin deck plating. It exploded inside the engine room. A terrible explosion shook the ship. It wasn't torn in two. It was lifted out of the water. The entire middle section of the ship disappeared in a fireball. Fire and thick black smoke shot straight into the sky. The blast pressure blew everyone on deck into the sea. The hull was broken, folded. The 1,000-ton ship began to sink. Seawater rushed into the burning engine room, creating a cloud of scalding steam. It sank very quickly. The bow pointed to the sky one last time, like a final salute. Then it slid down, disappearing into the churning water. The sea, where the ship had just sunk, was left with only an oil slick and burning debris. The sea continued to burn. Seawater rushed into the burning engine room, creating a cloud of scalding steam. Then it slid down, disappearing into the churning water. At the northern border, the Kuatu Valley was now dead silent. The roaring cannons had fallen silent. Only the crackling of fire and the whistling of wind through the shattered turrets remained. Thick black smoke still rose from dozens of tank wrecks from both sides, turning the valley into a giant steel scrapyard. The surviving tanks from both sides had pulled back. The head-on tank battle had ended in a bloody stalemate. Neither side could advance. The Chinese forces had been stopped, but the cost was terrible. The Vietnamese armored forces also suffered heavy losses, losing experienced crews. Burnt-out tank wrecks were scattered on the only road, blocking the entrance. No one could pass, not even rescue forces. On the Spratly Sea, the situation was no better. After the Vietnamese frigate was sunk, the remaining warships of both sides had pulled back out of effective range. They just watched each other through binoculars, cannons still aimed at the enemy, but no one fired. The sky was controlled by Chinese aircraft, but they also didn't dare fly too close to the remaining Vietnamese ships, knowing the air defense systems were still ready. Both fronts were bogged down. On the sea, the sunken ship's wreck, debris, and vast oil slicks. On land, burnt-out tank wrecks, artillery craters, and the thick stench of death. No clear winner, only destruction. News of the two simultaneous engagements began to leak to the world. Capitals from Washington to Moscow, Tokyo to Brussels, were holding emergency meetings. The world held its breath. On the coral reef in the Spratlys, the just-raised Chinese flag was already torn by the sea wind. In the valley on the border, the corpse of a Vietnamese tanker lay slumped over the cannon, his hand still gripping the trigger. The war had paused, but no one knew for how long it would stop. Peace had been torn to shreds. Only a bloody stalemate remained.